Hello, cruel world. Mr. Ewing was a man who murdered his wife in Kent in 2013. So what drove him to do this? What incidents in his background might have contributed to his outlook and also his misogyny and led to his violence? What's my professional psychoanalysis of a wife murderer? I'll answer all of these questions and many, many more in this episode of Psych for Sore Minds. My name is Dr. Sohom Das. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. I educate whilst you levitate. I educate while you vegetate. So an interesting aspect of my world of forensic psychiatry is psychoanalysis of individual defendants, because they often have horrific backgrounds. If you're a fan of this channel, you'll know that I do high profile cases. I do that for this channel, I also do it for documentaries. And I've got to be honest, a lot of it is speculation because there's not that much info available to me about the perpetrator's background. There are exceptions to this, so on this very channel, A Psych for Sore Minds, you'll see some episodes including that of Robert Maudsley, who's a British serial killer. He killed 4 people, 1 in the community, 1 in Broadmoor, and 2 in prison. And the 2 in prison were even on the same day, so you can't knock the man's work ethic. And also Anders Breivik, the Norwegian who killed 77 people. I also have information on him and I've done a psychoanalysis. Also not quite as well known, but there's Tyler Hadley, who killed his parents at the age of only 17 in 2011. I'm just mentioning this episode because to me there's a clear link between his parents' treatment of him and his horrific actions. Got videos on all of them, go check it out. However, more often there's actually very little information about the perpetrator, so I struggle to say how their previous life events have affected their personality and their characters. To be honest, it's much easier to discuss real life patients because all of the information is available to me to do that. And I've really wanted to do a video for you guys on this, dear viewers, for a long time. But I've been really busy with other things. You know me, I'm a nice guy. I've been busy helping kittens cross the road and rescuing old women from trees. But I'm going to tell you about a real life patient. His name is Mr. Ewing, obviously not his real name. He's a man that I rehabilitated on a medium secure unit about 5 years ago. I've changed his name, I've changed some demographic details, etc. But the essence of this case is real. So the first question, what was Mr. Ewing's index offence? Very serious, obviously. It was murder of his wife in 2013. This happened shortly after their relationship broke down. He stabbed her several times in the living room after an argument they had. So it goes without saying that this is obviously a horrific offence and the suffering of the victim cannot be forgotten. So for all you hunchback trolls out there on your keyboards, this video is not about excusing to any degree his actions, but rather to understand Mr. Ewing and others like him. That's the essence of what being a forensic psychiatrist is. So Mr. Ewing had spent about 7 years in prison for murder, and then he was transferred to this medium secure unit where I worked with him. If you want to know a bit more about what happens on these medium secure units, check out my video about life on a psychiatric ward, what it's really like. So when Mr. Ewing had assessments in prison, he did show some level of insight into his index offence and his previous substance misuse, but not actually about his own personality structure. And I thought he needed to do this to really decrease his future risk. So myself and my multidisciplinary team helped him understand that through intense psychotherapy. So I've picked this case as it really stands out because there's clear connections between Mr. Ewing's childhood traumas and his adult behaviour. So let's take it back. What are the significant elements of Mr. Ewing's background? Well, sadly, his mother abandoned him when he was about 1 year old, and he had no further contact with her for many, many years until he was in prison. Mr. Ewing was fostered and then he was eventually adopted, and he kind of got mixed messages about why he was abandoned at birth. He was told by his foster parents that his mother was a drug addict, and he was told by services that she was too young to handle him. His foster parents provided for him physically, but he felt kind of emotionally rejected by them. He described the other foster children as having more love and affection, and that he was more harshly punished. And what happened is he developed these feelings of worthlessness and of feeling unimportant, and that the people around him and the world would just reject him. He described that his foster mother was emotionally harsh, often insulting him. She would constantly be telling him that he was useless, and she was also physically abusive towards him, such as hitting him with a belt. In fact, he recalled this incident to me when he was a little boy, I think maybe 10 or 11. Him and his siblings, his foster siblings, were jumping up and down on the sofa. They tore the fabric. All the others got told off, and according to Mr. Ewing, he got the belt. His foster father was in the house, but he was very distant, he was very dismissive, and Mr. Ewing said that he'd spend days in the same house as his foster father without even talking to him. So initially, Mr. Ewing was quite paranoid. He felt that his foster parents only really looked after him because they got paid to do it. And unfortunately, this idea was reinforced when he was asked to leave at the age of 16, which is when the foster funding had run out. Mr. Ewing was sexually abused during a school trip by a teacher on one occasion around the age of 10, and he didn't tell anybody about this until years later during therapy in our medium secure unit. And I have to say that previous sexual abuse is a common theme. I've seen it in Robert Maudsley and also Robert Napper. He's a man who killed a random woman in front of her child in Wimbledon Common in 1992. Fascinating case, go check out my video on this channel about him. Mr. Ewing got a reasonable qualifications and he had a number of manual jobs. He was working as a taxi driver and as a delivery driver. In fact, he was doing these things right up until his index offence. He had used drugs heavily in his early teens, though not really leading up to his adulthood, not leading up to the murder. He had issues with low mood on and off throughout his life, and he actually took an overdose at the age of 18, although he was never formally diagnosed. He'd never previously seen a psychiatrist. So, what were the circumstances leading up to the murder? Mr. Ewing started having an intimate relationship with the victim in his late teens, and they subsequently married when they were both 20. So, dear viewers, I'm interested to know, do you think that most marriages that young, say 20 or under, are doomed to fail or not? Do you yourself or know of anybody that's had a marriage of this age that's worked out well? I'm genuinely interested to know. Let me know in the comments below. However, in Mr. Ewing's case, unfortunately, they became quite emotionally detached very quickly. Mr. Ewing would spend his time fishing or going down the pub when he wasn't working, rather than spending time with his wife, even when they had a young baby. Mr. Ewing felt that he provided for her financially, even though he didn't connect with her emotionally, and therefore he felt that he was doing his duty. He was providing a salary. He never questioned his worth as a husband or even as a father. Mr. Ewing even told me that he'd feel a sense of relief when he would come home some days from work or from fishing, and his wife and the baby had gone to his wife's sister's home, which was down the road. And this was happening more and more. She was spending nights away from him, and inevitably, you know how this story goes, their marriage fell apart. So the index offence occurred when they were both in their late 20s, and Mr. Ewing just went into this murderous rage. They had this argument about her forgetting to withdraw some cash for him as she had promised, and they were watching TV together, and then in the ad break, Mr. Ewing goes to the kitchen, he grabs a kitchen knife, comes back and stabs her 20 times. And what did he do immediately after this? Nothing. He just sat there with the dead body in the house for about 2 days. He told me that he considered going on the run, but then decided that he just didn't think it was worth it, so he called the police himself, turned himself back in. So following incarceration in Belmarsh, Mr. Ewing tried to contact his biological mother, who said she wanted nothing to do with him because he was a criminal. And 7 years later, he was transferred over to the medium secure unit, which is where I saw him. So what were Mr. Ewing's behavioural traits after incarceration in prison, and more importantly, in the psychiatric unit? And what does this teach him about his personality and about his outlook? Well, Mr. Ewing was very low-key in prison and on the psych ward. He would often argue with prisoners over kind of petty issues like the size of the food portion he was given, and he actually got beaten up on more than one occasion, but I suspect he was targeted because he was a wife murderer, and as you probably know, there's like a hierarchy of criminals within prison. Mr. Ewing was generally isolative. He spent most of his time in his room or in his cell rather than in the communal areas in hospital and in prison. So as a consultant forensic psychiatrist on the ward, my job would be to discuss individual patients and their behaviours and their symptoms with nurses, who's suffering from acute psychosis, who needs a change in medication, who's being aggressive, who's being paranoid, etc., etc. That was part of the job. But I have to say, Mr. Ewing kind of blended into the furniture, and we often had to remember that he was even there, to remember to talk about him, to get some sort of feedback. The other thing that really stood out is that he was very mistrusting. So for example, he felt that the psychologist on the team who oversaw his therapy was being overly friendly, and he believed that she was trying to be fake to exploit him so that she could kind of extract this symptomatology out of him just so that she could write a court report. So to me, we're seeing themes of avoidance, we're seeing insecurity. Okay, now let's get to the crux of this episode. Pay attention, kids. because there will be a test at the end. 𝐸 Bombay! What were Mr. Ewing's personality traits and how were they manifested through his childhood experiences? How did this all lead to his horrific offences? Well, I would identify paranoia as one massive missing piece of the puzzle. He said that others were trying to control him. He always tried to assess the power dynamic of any relationship. And that would be from his wife to work colleagues, to prison guards, to even myself as his psychiatrist. His thought in entering any kind of dynamic or relationship was, what do they want from me? And this was sparked by his overwhelming sense of abandonment and abuse. Firstly, being abandoned by his biological mother, then being ignored by his foster father, then being physically chastised by his foster mother, and then being sexually abused by his teacher. Mr. Ewing resisted this sense of being controlled by fighting back against the people he perceived to be mistreating him or abusing him. This would show when he had an argument with prisoners, even though it would lead to a battering. And I think it's really relevant to this offence. So he felt that his wife was abandoning him. He felt that his wife was provoking him. Now, just to be crystal clear, I'm not excusing his behaviour. His reaction obviously was inexcusable, and I'm not saying that his wife did anything wrong. I'm just describing the perception, his perception and his paranoid perspective. Because, as the great philosopher Socrates once said, make sure you have toilet paper before you shit on my nose. Another huge relevant factor is Mr. Ewing's disconnection and detachment to other people. Before I expand on this, I just want to introduce you to this channel. You are watching a Psych for Sore Minds. I make a whole range of videos where I dissect the overlap between offending and mental illness. Sometimes I look at high-profile criminal cases. I give my own psychoanalysis. Sometimes I talk about my own patients, like in this case. Sometimes I interview people. Sometimes I talk about individual diagnoses, blah, 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 blah. There's something for everybody on this channel, and I implore you to subscribe, because not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it actually reverses global warming, guaranteed, or your money back. So why was Mr. Ewing's disconnection and detachment to other people relevant in this case? Well, it's not only about his own functioning and socializing. I mean, he didn't really have any hobbies or friends, but it would also make him more isolated and marginalized. And crucially, from my point of view, it made it harder to convince him to engage in therapy. And this, I think, was learnt behaviour. He'd learned to cut himself off from a young age to avoid his foster parents, one of whom, as I said, would physically chastise him with a belt, and the other would ignore him. And this, I think, was reflected in his relationship with his wife, when they became emotionally distant very quickly. It's also kind of reflected, I think, with him not mingling with his peers in prison and on the psychiatric ward. But I'm glad to say that with some therapy, Mr. Ewing was able to understand where these personality traits and these outlooks had come from. He was able to recognise that they were bleeding into so many different aspects of his life. Now, all of this therapy is not just about Mr. Ewing becoming more fulfilled and happier as a person, but it's actually about decreasing his risk of future offending in the long term after he's discharged from hospital, because he might well have other future relationships. And services can monitor this, like probation services, for example, but they can't control it and they can't stop it. So crucially, by giving Mr. Ewing the tools to understand what the triggers were, this massively decreases his risk of doing this kind of similar offence in the future. So, to give you some closure on this case, Mr. Ewing was gradually interacted more, he engaged better in therapy, he became less paranoid, less withdrawn on the ward, and he generally became less suspicious of those around him. Over time, his behaviour on the ward improved, he was less argumentative, less aggressive, and eventually he was released from hospital. And after that, he was on long-term supervision by a consultant forensic psychiatrist in the community. So, dear viewers, before I finish, a quick question for you. Do any of these personality traits or experiences seem familiar to you? Have you yourself or any people that you know gone through something this kind of serious? Please share your stories and your thoughts in the comment sections below. I love having a chat with you, dear people. So, to conclude, there's lots of true crime channels and podcasts. A lot of them talk about the crime and the punishment of the perpetrator. And I get this. Obviously, it's essential and it's part of the criminal justice system. But I'm trying to offer you a different perspective. Think of me as a pair of spectacles, a sexy, funny, international pair of spectacles of mystery. I hope I've helped you understand why some perpetrators act the way they do. And the truth is, that the vast majority of perpetrators of violent crimes are or have been victims at some point in their life. It's the truth. It's an uncomfortable truth. More uncomfortable than that horrific bright red jumper that your granny knitted for you. More uncomfortable than that family Christmas when you asked your great uncle what he really thought of the Black Lives Matter movement. Anyway, I've rambled on enough. Stay euthymic. Go check out my book. It's going to be called In Two Minds, Professional Memoirs of a Forensic Psychiatrist, i.e. me. Talk about a lot of my cases in a lot more detail. It's a lot more autobiographical. Cop it in March 2022. I think there's a pre-order link somewhere. Please tell all your friends and enemies about this channel. I need more subs. My fragile ego needs reassurance. Until next time, stay euthymic, and whatever happens, do not forget, I love you.